This is one of the best combinations I've seen in the entire tournament. Get ready for this one. So e4 played here by Nodirbek Just. He has to win the game because this is Armageddon. The classical was drawn. Hikaru's just got to draw. So what does Hikaru do? Well, he employs the Berlin defense, just like he did in the classical game, but he actually is the first to deviate. Now Hikaru takes here, and if you go d4, this is the main line move, and you see the queens coming off the board. The famous or infamous Berlin endgame, depending how you look at it. But we see rook e1 from Nodirbek, different variation. The knight drops back, and now this pawn is captured. So although this knight is threatening to take the bishop, there's no time to do so, or this one moves with discovered checks. So bishop e7 blocks the file, best move, and now this bishop tucks all the way back, and Hikaru could take on e5. It's a different variation, but he starts with knight to f5, freeing the way for the d pawn to move. And now knight f3. So it keeps pieces on the board, keeps tension, great in an Armageddon, and that is the main move in the position. So castles is now played. We get pawn d4, d5 from Hikaru, pawn to c3, and bishop d6. Good looking square for that bishop, a bit more activated here, and it also frees the knight to maneuver to e7, also opens the e-file, very harmonious. We get knight b to d2, standard kind of developing move in king's pawn games. This knight comes round to e7, and now a4 is not the main move. You normally see bishop d3 there, but okay, we see these rook's pawns get chucked so often these days. That's what AlphaZero showed us. Gaining that space can be really advantageous. So the bishop now develops to d3. We get pawn c6, and now knight f1 begins a standard remaneuver, and the next move is the move of a man who understands the black structure. So what does Hikaru play? Well, pawn to g6. Because not only does it bolster this square, which is often used as a swapping off pieces square, but it also frees this knight to remaneuver to g6 and then e6. Why is that desirable? Well, then this one can come to f5. At the minute, they're kind of treading on each other's toes. They both want to occupy the same square. So bishop d2 develops. Why not bishop g5, by the way? Well, then you're running into f6. Now, Ben Feingold tells us to never play f6, right? But in this circumstance, f6 can be quite desirable, especially covering the e5 square from a knight hop. So, okay, bishop d2, knight g7 prepares that remaneuver, knight g3 from Abdusattorov, and now knight e to f5 is played, and queen b3. Now there's a small drop in the eval bar there. The computer was looking for c4, but okay, not a bad move. Pressures this pawn, and it now sets up ideas to take here, say knight recaptures, bishop takes, and you couldn't take back with the bishop, or you lose the pawn. You'd have to take like this. Obviously that's a horrible pawn structure. So Hikaru has to do something, and how many of us would play this one? Not what Hikaru does, because positionally you actually don't want to trade off this knight, which had nowhere to jump, but coming back here, Hikaru goes knight h4 because he wants to trade off this knight. Great positional chess, really instructive. Why does he want to trade this one? Well, this is the powerful one. It can jump to e5 especially. I mean, it also looks at g5, and Nodirbek has to exchange. He didn't have anything better. The queen recaptures, and now great play by him, knight to f1. So he's not hanging checkmate. The knight does cover that square, and he's got this long-term plan of pushing this pawn and remanœuvering this knight to the desirable f3 square. So Hikaru drops his queen all the way back home. Not a forced move by any means. You know, you could go queen f6, knight e6 are some of the top moves. But okay, this is flexible. Could come to c7. Look at this pawn's defense. Free this one up, etc. We now get h3, giving this knight a hopping square. Knight e6 played, looks at the f4 square in combination with the bishop, and so bishop h6 first, kicks the rook, and now g3 stops that one. You do weaken this pawn, but okay, king g2, you can always take care of that. And it's a good thing to think about pawn structures. Anytime you're about to weaken a pawn, think, how could I defend it? How could my opponent attack it? You know, it's a good way to hedge your thinking. Now, bishop d7 played, and you do not take this one because it actually ends the game on the spot. You could just keep perpetualing on this white queen. That ends the game. You know, you could even take here as black if you were trying to win, but all Hikaru needs is a draw. So this one not captured. We see knight h2, carrying on with the plan. Bishop f8 now played, getting rid of that annoying bishop. The king recaptures, and you can see the dark squares now. Swiss cheese around the king. Could be, what's the word I'm trying to look for? Exploited. It's late in the evening, 10 o'clock. Could be exploited in the future. And h4 starts to look at those ideas. You know, running this pawn down here. Queen c7 now from Hikaru, connects the rooks, looks on the dark squares a bit more, covers this pawn. Okay, I know I mentioned we don't really want to be taking that one, but okay, not a bad move. The knight hits f3, and now here, this next move is just the start of Hikaru's position getting difficult. So the top computer move is knight g7, and I do really like that one, because it stops the pawn from pushing on here. Say Nodirbek carries on, not pawn c4. Say he carries on with knight e5 here. Well, now you can start this bishop f5 stuff. You know, look to initiate exchanges, and black is pretty solid. But what we see in the game is king g7. Now knight e5. This bishop is pressured. Now, because the knight's not here, you know, there's no bishop f5 anymore. So Hikaru drops it back here. And now queen c2 is a great move and a tricky move. At first, I thought it was gearing up maybe b3, c4, you know, supporting that stuff. But actually, I think the idea is if you go f6 now to kick this knight, as you'd like to do, then can you see the combination for white to have this deadly attack? So, the move you can play here is bishop takes on g6. There's no time to take here, or you lose this rook and it's actually unprotected. You know, the back rank not covered, the rooks aren't connected. And yes, you can go e4 to shut out a load of white pieces, but still after the bishop drops back, you know, having the exchange up should be good enough to long term do well. And the king's quite exposed. And just coming back here, if instead of taking that one, you take here, well, now the queen crashes through, you have to go to f8, stay with the rook, and then okay, this is just a pretty deadly attack. Black does have defensive tries, but it gives it half a pawn advantage to white. So no f6 played. Instead, Hikaru plays a different move, and it's a mistake. One of his top moves here was knight f8. His absolute top one was knight c5. I just really want to show you this, because if captures, you take here. What an awesome resource. And you're on the bishop, so if you don't capture, if you come back like this, then there's bishop f5. So knight c5, what an amazing option. Sorry for the sidelines, but they're pretty cool, right? But Hikaru, blunders, pretty much a blunder, you know, really bad, +1 swing. He goes c5, and this just opens up this huge b5 square. The rook comes to e7, and now queen d2 starts to look at these dark squares, and this pawn push is coming. And so h5 should be played by Hikaru here. It's the top move by miles, just to stop that pawn pushing. But I can understand him not doing it. You further weaken more dark squares, of course. So he goes knight f8, the move that could have been played earlier, but this time you're leaving all of these squares for the white queen, and the pawn now kicks on. And Hikaru makes things even worse. This time he should go f6 once again, but he goes c4, shuts down things on the queen side. Nodirbek now can turn a free hand to the king. So he pushes on, the king drops back, and now he invades with this queen. Queen g5, also a good move there. Now there's a simple threat to go queen f6 and deliver checkmate here. And if you go knight e6 to attack the queen, cover the square, well, you don't want to encourage that queen in because it just dominates the position. f4, f5 is coming. There's also ideas of knight g4, queen to e5, and then hopping in here. You know, if the queen ever starts remaneuvering, just very unpleasant. And if you go queen d6 to cover the square like that, well, now you're walking into tons of tactics involving knight g6, defending the queen, but opening up this pressure here. And there's threats down here. Now you actually start with rook e2 to line up all those tactics without letting black take with a check. I don't want to click down all the lines, but those are the tactical problems with queen d6. So instead, f5 is played to just stop that queen invasion, but this is where Nodirbek unleashes just an absolutely awesome move. It really is cool. So do pause if you want to look for it. It's not an easy one. So the move played here, you maybe thought about removing the knight, but it's not knight takes on g6, it's knight takes on c4. Double exclam, what the hell is going on here? So let's look at the obvious first. What happens if you take that knight with the pawn? You're giving me a piece for a pawn, right? Well, then we take with check. Now, after the queen captures, let's explore that line here, the obvious move. Well, then you take on e7, and there's this slow motion killer threat of queen e5, queen g7 checkmate. And how do you stop it? You can't. If you go queen d5 to cover the square, then there's c4, decoying the queen, and if you look at the position, there's just no squares the queen can go to. It's got to go queen f7, you know, something stupid, and that's just completely lost. So coming back here, queen d5 no good. What if you try and cover this square with the knight? Well, now there's another nice finish, but it doesn't involve immediately taking and then queen e5, or else queen f7 covers. So you do it in a clever way first. You check. Now, if the king comes here, this is check, check, and mate, like this. Okay, there wasn't two checks there. But if the king comes this way, well, now you take the knight. This is the key difference, because after the bishop captures, you take with check. Now the king comes back and you deliver mate. You know, because you checked, there was no time for the queen to cover. So some very nice lines there involving pawn takes and queen takes back. Bishop takes and queen takes back. And if the queen doesn't take back, say you do something like knight e6, well, now you can simply take the queen. Rook recaptures and you win this piece. You go into an endgame where you're, what, 2 pawns up here? Just completely hopeless. So these are the lines with the pawn taking the knight. In the game, we see queen takes. What happens if you take the rook with check? Rook recaptures. Again, you can take the queens off. But still, and then takes here, but then there's this killer move, you're still a piece down, check, the king goes, and rook e8. There's these back rank problems. This is a threat to take with checkmate, so you have to move this bishop. You know, this is just a hopeless line, basically. That one's even pinned. Let's go to checkmate, just for some fun. There's a checkmate on the board. Just the most stunning lines here. So Hikaru takes the queen off, we see pawn recaptures, and now he goes knight e6. So he's blocking that e-file, but it's the shakiest defense ever. You know, he's looking at this pawn, but simply knight b6 now played, hits this one, it moves to b8, and Hikaru actually resigns in disgust with his position, shaking his head. Why? Well, the material is equal here, even though white's got the huge attack. So you can take a second pawn, hit this rook, okay, and it can move away and you come back, and yeah, you just carry on attacking. You know, if you take this pawn, for example, you can check, the rook blocks, bishop c4 check. This is just a sample line here where you literally win a piece. All game over. So this was the final position, and these are the standings after round 8. So it all comes down to tomorrow. Fabi versus Hikaru. That's the mouth-watering encounter for the tournament. Stay tuned, get subscribed to never miss a future video, and if you want to see another amazing game, then check out the video on screen. Thanks very much for watching, and see you soon.